Welcome to this exploration of one of the most unsettling cases documented in West Virginia's history. Before we proceed, I encourage you to share in the comments where you are tuning in from, along with the precise time you are hearing this narration. We are curious to learn which locations and what hours of the day or night these recorded stories manage to reach. The earliest signs that something was wrong in the modest mining settlement of Blackwood Hollow, situated deep within West Virginia's Appalachian Mountains, did not originate from law enforcement. Instead, they emerged from a series of annotations made in the parish register of St. Matthew's Episcopal Church. The year was 1878, and Reverend Thomas Whittaker had begun placing small crosses next to certain names in the death registry. When questioned regarding this habit years afterward, his successor claimed to have no knowledge of what they signified. The crosses, now faded by time, are still visible in the church records maintained by the Blackwood County Historical Society archives. There are 17 crosses, spanning from February through December of that year. The discovery of these notations occurred nearly 50 years after the events themselves, when local historian Edward Chambers was organizing church documents for the county's centennial celebration in 1927. Chambers, who later produced extensive writings on the region's coal mining history, observed the oddity in his research journal. The marks appear intentional, made with a pen distinct from that used for the main entries. They carry the characteristics of a warning or marker, known only to Reverend Whittaker himself. In light of later events, one cannot help but wonder if the good Reverend had suspicions long before others did. What renders these simple crosses especially chilling is their systematic application. According to preservation experts who inspected the registry in 1965, the crosses were added at various times using slightly different inks, indicating that Reverend Whittaker applied each mark as deaths transpired, rather than inscribing them all at once, after concerns had been raised. This suggests a mounting unease that evolved throughout that fateful year, a silent witness to unfolding events that would only later be revealed. What we can state with certainty is that between the brutal winter of early 1878 and the first snowfall of December, 17 funerals took place in Blackwood Hollow, a community of barely 200 people. Even when accounting for the harsh realities of mining life and the typhoid outbreak that claimed several lives that spring, the number struck county officials as remarkably high when they later reviewed the records. Even more peculiar was that every one of those 17 services had been catered by the Blackwood sisters, Margaret and Ruth, who resided in a modest 2-story house at the edge of town, near where the old McCreary Mine Road vanished into thick forest. The death rate in Blackwood Hollow during this era surpasses statistical norms for comparable mining communities by nearly 40%. According to demographic research conducted by West Virginia University in the 1950s. Dr. Elias Montgomery, who specialized in historical public health studies, observed in his findings that while mining communities certainly endured higher mortality rates due to accidents and poor living conditions, Blackwood Hollow's death records for 1878 represent a notable statistical anomaly. Even more puzzling is that the deaths spanned all age groups and causes. From mining accidents to childhood illnesses to seemingly natural deaths among the elderly, with no discernible pattern beyond their unusual frequency. County records indicate that in the 3 years preceding the Blackwood sisters' arrival, Blackwood Hollow averaged 7 deaths annually. In 1878, that number more than doubled. Following their departure, the death rate immediately returned to prior levels, with only 6 recorded deaths in 1879. Despite no notable changes in population, mining safety regulations, or public health infrastructure, An additional peculiarity observed by investigators at the time, but largely disregarded in subsequent historical accounts, was the geographic distribution of these deaths. When mapped against property records, the deaths formed a rough circle expanding outward from the Blackwood home, as if something emanated from that central point. Whether this pattern held statistical importance or was merely coincidental remains a matter of debate among modern researchers who have studied the case. According to the Blackwood County Tax Assessment Rolls of 1877, the sisters had arrived in Blackwood Hollow in late autumn of that year. They presented themselves as widows from Baltimore, seeking a quieter existence after losing their husbands in a warehouse fire. The county clerk noted in the margin of their property deed that they paid in cash. Unusual for the time and place. No records from Baltimore substantiate their account of widowhood or residence there. However, such verification was rarely pursued in remote communities desperate for new residents, particularly women willing to perform services that few others would handle. The original property deed, preserved in county archives, bears witness to this unusual transaction. The document, dated October 17, 1877, records the sale of one dwelling house and surrounding acre of land, formerly belonging to the late Edmund Hargrove, to Margaret and Ruth Blackwood, widows formerly of Baltimore, Maryland, for the sum of $78, a considerable amount to have in cash at that time. The clerk's marginal note reads, "Payment rendered in full gold coin. Most unusual. Ladies refused bank draft." Local newspaper archives provide a glimpse of how the community initially perceived these newcomers. The Blackwood County Register, a weekly publication serving the region, mentioned their arrival in its October 23, 1877 edition. Two ladies of refinement have taken up residence in the old Hargrove property. The Mrs. Blackwood sisters and widows both bring a touch of city manners to our humble hollow. They attended Sunday services at St. Matthew's and have already made favorable impressions upon the Ladies' Aid Society. Interviews conducted with surviving residents in the 1920s, when historian Edward Chambers was researching his monograph on the county's development, suggest that the sisters made a calculated effort to appear both respectable and somewhat mysterious. Martha Holloway, who was 16 years old when the Blackwood sisters arrived, recalled, "They dressed well but not flashy, always in black as befitting widows. But the fabric was fine, finer than anything available at Henderson's general store. They spoke softly with what we took to be Baltimore accents, though my father, who had business in Baltimore once, said later their way of talking wasn't quite right." The sisters purchased the old Hargrove property, a weathered clapboard house that had stood empty for nearly 3 years, following the death of its previous owner. Local accounts described how the women set about making immediate improvements. New curtains appeared in windows, the sagging front porch was repaired, and a substantial kitchen garden was established behind the house, even before the first snow fell. Neighbors reported that the sisters kept largely to themselves during those first months, though they attended Sunday services at St. Matthew's with regularity. Edmund Hargrove, the previous owner, had died in 1874 under circumstances that some locals considered suspicious. According to county death records, the official cause was listed as apoplexy, what we would now recognize as a stroke. But rumors persisted that Hargrove, a reclusive bachelor known for prospecting in the surrounding hills, had discovered something valuable and met with foul play. No evidence ever substantiated these claims, but the property remained unsold for years due partly to these whispers and partly to its isolated location at the forest's edge. The Blackwood sisters' choice of this particular property raised few eyebrows at the time, given its affordable price. but in retrospect certain features of the house seem noteworthy. The cellar, unusually large for houses of that era and region, had been dug deep into the hillside with stone walls and a packed earth floor. A spring ran beneath the property, providing year-round fresh water through a hand pump installed in the kitchen, a rare convenience for the area. Most significant was the house's distance from neighbors. The nearest dwelling stood nearly a quarter-mile away, allowing for considerable privacy. These showed purchases of unusual items alongside typical household necessities, large quantities of salt, borax, and alcohol, several yards of oilcloth, glass jars in various sizes, and specialized tools, including a set of fine saws and what the receipt described as surgical scissors. When questioned later, Thomas Henderson, proprietor of the store, claimed he assumed these items were for women's household arts and putting up preserves. It was Margaret, the elder at 42, who first offered their services to the community. The renovations undertaken by the sisters were documented in a series of receipts from Henderson's general store found during the subsequent investigation. After the sudden death of mining foreman Jacob Finley in January 1878, she approached his widow with an offer to prepare food for those attending the wake. She appeared like Providence itself. Eleanor Finley later told the Blackwood County Register in an interview published on April 17, 1879. There I was with 4 children and a husband gone cold, and no thought of how to feed the mourners. Margaret Blackwood simply arrived at my door and said it would all be taken care of. I remember her exact words. The bereaved should not have to think about such things. The timing of Margaret's offer has been a subject of historical scrutiny. Jacob Finley's death occurred suddenly, when a support beam collapsed in the south shaft of the McCreary mine. According to the mine superintendent's accident report filed the same day, Finley died instantly at approximately 10:30 in the morning. Yet, Margaret Blackwood appeared at the Finley home with her offer of assistance at 11:45 a.m., according to Eleanor Finley's later testimony. Before official notification of the death had been delivered by the mine owner's representative, who did not arrive until afternoon. When questioned about this discrepancy during the subsequent investigation, Margaret claimed she had been at Henderson's general store when news of the accident reached town and had immediately gone to offer assistance. However, Thomas Henderson's daily sales ledger for that date shows no record of either sister making purchases that morning, and no other witnesses recalled seeing Margaret in the town center around that time. This inconsistency, while noted in Sheriff Mills's investigative file, was not considered significant at the time. In retrospect, it represents the first of several instances where the Blackwood sisters displayed knowledge of deaths seemingly before official information was available, a pattern that becomes more disturbing in light of later revelations. By all accounts preserved in local newspapers and personal correspondence, the sisters' first catering service was received with gratitude and some measure of awe. Ruth, 7 years younger than Margaret, had apparently trained in French cooking techniques, unusual skills for the region. The mourners at Jacob Finley's wake found themselves served delicate pastries, roasted meats seasoned with herbs, grown in the sisters' own garden, and a sweet cordial that Margaret claimed was restorative to the grieving spirit. In an era when funeral meats typically consisted of simple hearty fare prepared by neighboring women, the Blackwood sisters' offerings represented an unexpected refinement. The Charleston Daily Mail, which occasionally reported on events in outlying communities, sent a junior reporter to cover Finley's funeral due to his prominence in the local mining industry. The resulting article, published January 28, 1878, made specific mention of the refreshments, The mourners were treated to viands of surprising quality, more reminiscent of a Richmond hotel than a mining community wake. Particularly noted was a sweet cordial served in small glasses, which several attendees credited with easing their sorrow temporarily. This cordial would later become a subject of intense interest to investigators. Its recipe was never found among the sisters' belongings, though multiple witnesses described its effects consistently, a feeling of warmth spreading through the body, followed by a noticeable diminishment of grief and anxiety lasting several hours. Modern pharmacologists who have studied the case suggest the drink likely contained laudanum or a similar opiate tincture combined with alcohol and sweeteners to mask the bitter taste, a common ingredient in many medicinal preparations of the era, but one that would have been unusually potent in the sisters' specific formulation. "I've never tasted anything like it," wrote Jonathan Pierce, the mine owner, in a letter to his brother in Richmond, dated February 3, 1878. "These sisters have brought a level of refinement to our little hollow that one wouldn't expect possible. The elder one, Margaret, has a certain gravity about her that commands respect. The younger is quieter, but watchful. Their food was remarkable, particularly a cordial they served that seemed to ease the ache of grief, at least for a time. I found myself able to discuss business matters with Finley's replacement mere hours after helping lower the poor man into the ground. A clarity of mind I would not have thought possible amidst such sorrow." What happened next has been pieced together from fragmented accounts, personal journals, and the eventual inquest documents filed in 1879. The pattern emerged slowly, almost imperceptibly, like a faint shape forming in fog. After the Finley funeral, the sisters were soon called upon again when miner Samuel Cook's young wife succumbed to pneumonia in late February. The county death register indicates she passed on February 26th, and her funeral was held 2 days later. Then again, when the Cooper twins, boys of just 9 years, drowned in the swollen creek after spring rains. Each time Margaret and Ruth appeared with their baskets and trays, serving mourners with quiet efficiency. Each time those who partook of their offerings later reported feeling peculiarly at peace despite their grief. The drowning of the Cooper twins on April 3, 1878 represents a particularly significant event in the Blackwood sisters' activities. According to contemporary newspaper accounts, the boys, Matthew and Joseph Cooper, disappeared while playing near Blackwood Creek during the seasonal flooding. Their bodies were recovered the following morning approximately a mile downstream, tangled in flood debris. What makes this incident notable is a detail recorded in Sheriff Mills's personal journal, but omitted from his official report. The bodies were discovered by Ruth Blackwood, who claimed to have been gathering herbs along the creek bank early that morning. This marked the second instance where one of the sisters was first to discover a death or body. More significantly, when Mills later interviewed the boys' playmates, 10-year-old William Thatcher reported seeing the quieter sister watching the twins from the trees shortly before their disappearance, a claim his parents discouraged him from repeating, believing it would bring the family unwanted attention. The Cooper funeral brought the sisters into even greater prominence within the community. Not only did they cater the event, but they also offered for the first time to assist in preparing the bodies for burial. This practice, while not unusual in itself, represented an expansion of their involvement with the community's dead. Mrs. Cooper, overwhelmed by the loss of both sons simultaneously, gratefully accepted their assistance. "They were so gentle with my boys," she later told investigators. Miss Margaret said, "It would be too painful for a mother to do such a thing," and she was right. They took the bodies to the back bedroom and worked for nearly 2 hours. When they were finished, my Matthew and Joseph looked so peaceful, almost like they were sleeping. Miss Ruth had even placed wild flowers in their hands. Dr. William Hers, the only physician serving Blackwood Hollow and 3 neighboring settlements, noted in his personal ledger on April 12, 1878, that several patients had mentioned experiencing unusual drowsiness and a certain distance from their sorrows after the wakes. He attributed this to the natural exhaustion of grief, though he did make a curious notation about the cordial served by the sisters, wondering if it might contain more than simple spirits. I have inquired as to the nature of the beverage provided by the Blackwood women. Hers wrote, Miss Ruth informed me it contains elderberry, honey, and various herbs from their garden. When pressed for specifics, she became evasive, claiming old family recipes are not freely shared. As a man of science, I find myself curious about its notable calming effect, which exceeds what one might expect from mere alcohol. Hers' medical ledger, preserved now in the West Virginia Medical Historical Society archives, contains additional observations that suggest his curiosity about the sisters extended beyond their cordial. On April 30, 1878, he wrote, encountered Miss Margaret Blackwood leaving the Sullivan home shortly after confirming old Mr. Sullivan's passing from consumption. She indicated she had come to express condolences, having heard the news. Upon inquiry, it emerged no one had yet been sent to inform the town of the death, which had occurred less than an hour before my arrival. When I remarked upon this coincidence, she merely smiled and said, in small communities, news travels quickly. The sisters' integration into the community accelerated through the spring months. Church attendance records show they participated in the ladies' sewing circle on Wednesday afternoons. They contributed preserves and baked goods to the Miners' Benevolent Fund auction in May. Margaret even served briefly as a substitute teacher when Miss Harriet Collins, who taught at the one-room schoolhouse, fell ill with typhoid. This period of integration appears strategic in retrospect. The sisters systematically established themselves in positions that provided access to community information and lowered natural suspicions about outsiders. The Ladies' Aid Society, which both sisters joined in March 1878, served as the primary gossip exchange of Blackwood Hollow, providing detailed knowledge of household affairs, illnesses, and personal histories. Margaret's brief tenure at the schoolhouse gave her access to every family with children, while Ruth's regular deliveries of herbal remedies to the sick established her as a welcome visitor in homes throughout the community. Yet, despite these social engagements, several accounts suggest the women maintained a certain distance. They never invited visitors to their home. They declined invitations to social gatherings unless they involved the entire community. And they were seen often walking together along the forest paths near their home, gathering plants and conversing in tones too low for others to hear when they happened to pass by. Isaac Thornfield, a local hunter, reported to Sheriff Mills that he had encountered the sisters deep in the forest on 3 separate occasions during the spring of 1878. They were a good 4 miles from town. His statement reads, "and places no ladies had business being." When I came upon them the second time, Miss Ruth was digging in the earth with a trowel, collecting roots in a cloth bag. Miss Margaret saw me first and stepped between me and her sister. They claimed to be gathering special herbs for their remedies, but something in their manner made me uneasy. They knew those woods better than folks who'd lived here all their lives. By summer, the sisters had become an institution in Blackwood Hollow. They carried our burdens, wrote Emmeline Parker in a letter to her sister in Richmond, dated July 10, 1878, now preserved in the Virginia State Historical Archives. When Thomas passed, I needn't have worried about a thing. The Blackwood women took care of everything from laying him out to feeding half the town. Ruth even helped dress the children for the service. I don't know what we would do without them now. In a place where death visits so regularly, they have become our angels of mercy. What Emmeline Parker couldn't have known was that her husband's funeral marked the beginning of what would later be termed the strange interval by county investigators. Thomas Parker's was the 8th funeral catered by the Blackwood sisters. It was also the first where someone, specifically Jeremiah Holloway, a cousin of the deceased, noted something odd about the weight of the coffin. "I've carried enough of my kinfolk to their rest," Holloway reportedly said to fellow pallbearer Michael Doyle as they walked the path to the churchyard cemetery. "Tom was a big man, worked the seam face with me for 15 years, but that box felt light as a child's." Doyle, according to his sworn statement given during the county investigation the following year, dismissed Holloway's observation. "Grief plays tricks on a man's mind and body," he claimed to have replied. "We're stronger than we know when carrying our own to rest." The Parker funeral, held on July 8, 1878, marked several firsts beyond Holloway's observation about the coffin's weight. It was the first instance where the sisters assumed complete control of the body immediately following death. Thomas Parker had died at home of what Dr. Hers diagnosed as heart failure following prolonged miner's lung. Within an hour of his passing, both Blackwood sisters arrived at the Parker home with their black valise of supplies, requesting the family leave them alone with the deceased to prepare him properly. This represented a significant departure from local custom, where family members, particularly women, would traditionally wash and dress their own dead. When Emmeline Parker's mother objected to being excluded from this ritual, Margaret reportedly told her, "A daughter-in-law's grief is too fresh for such duties. We will make him presentable for your final viewing." According to the testimony of Catherine Wells, Emmeline Parker's mother, the sisters remained alone with the body for nearly 3 hours. "When they finally allowed us in," she stated, "Thomas looked so peaceful. We could hardly believe it was the same man who had suffered so terribly in his final days. His sunken cheeks seemed fuller, his color almost lifelike." Miss Ruth said they had restored his dignity, whatever that might mean. The conversation might have ended there, noted and forgotten, had similar observations not begun to accumulate. At the Walsh girls' funeral in August, at old Miss Thornfield's in September, at both McCreary brothers' services in October, all the same murmured observation among the pallbearers: the coffin seemed unusually light. Lily Walsh, just 16 years old, died on August 3, 1878, allegedly from brain fever following a summer illness. Her father, Gerald Walsh, operated the assay office that served the local mining operations. His statement to Sheriff Mills, recorded in January 1879 after the truth about the Blackwood sisters had emerged, contains a detail absent from earlier accounts. The sisters insisted on closed casket viewing, claiming Lily's fever had left her features too altered for public display. "When I demanded to see my daughter one last time, they permitted only a brief viewing of her face alone, keeping the rest of the casket covered. Her face was powdered heavily, almost waxy in appearance. At the time, I attributed my sense that something was wrong to the natural distortions of grief." Esther Thornfield, a widow of 73, passed on September 17, 1878 from what appeared to be natural causes. As a prominent member of the community whose husband had once owned a significant portion of the mining interests in the area, her funeral was well attended. Her son, Franklin Thornfield, who had traveled from Philadelphia for the service, later reported, "I arrived after Mother had been prepared for burial by the Blackwood women. When I requested a moment alone with her, Miss Margaret seemed reluctant, but eventually agreed. I noticed Mother's hands, which had been gnarled with arthritis for 20 years, appeared unnaturally straight and smooth in the coffin. When I mentioned this, Miss Ruth quickly explained they had eased her joints to give her dignity in death. I accepted this explanation at the time, being too overcome to question further. It might have been dismissed as superstition or the effects of collective grief had Sheriff Clayton Mills not been present at the McCreary services in his official capacity. James and William McCreary, brothers who owned a small logging operation that supplied timber to the mines, had been killed when a stack of freshly cut logs shifted unexpectedly. Their funeral, held on October 12, 1878, was one of the largest the community had seen, with mourners coming from as far as Charleston. Mills, who maintained meticulous notes on county affairs in a series of leather-bound journals now held by the state archives, wrote that evening. Pallbearers commented on the lightness of both coffins. Having assisted myself with James McCreary's casket, I must concur the weight seemed inappropriate for a man of his stature. The matter bears consideration, though it may be nothing more than the carpenter's choice of thinner wood than is customary. The carpenter in question, Harold Whitman, when interviewed months later, insisted he had used the same seasoned oak for the McCreary coffins as he had for every other burial in Blackwood Hollow for the past 15 years. Each coffin used the standard 1-inch oak planking. His statement reads, "I have been building them the same way since I took over my father's workshop in '62. If anything, the McCreary coffins should have been heavier than most, as I added reinforcement to accommodate James's size. He was near to 300 pounds in life." Mills's journal entry following his interview with Whitman reveals growing suspicion. Whitman's testimony conflicts with my direct experience. James McCreary's coffin required only 4 men to carry comfortably, when 6 would be customary for a man of his size. Something is amiss. Though I hesitate to make accusations without firmer evidence, I have made discreet inquiries with Dr. Hers regarding the state of bodies following the Blackwood sisters' ministrations. Meanwhile, the sisters continued their work, becoming increasingly central to the community's handling of death. By autumn, they had expanded their services beyond catering. Margaret now offers to assist in the preparation of the body. Jane Whittaker, the Reverend's wife, wrote in her journal on October 23, 1878, "Several families have accepted, grateful to be spared the task. Ruth brings a black valise of supplies when they go to perform this service. They insist on privacy during this work." Mrs. Cooper said she heard them singing softly while they tended to her father. A hymn, she thought, though not one sung in our church. This expansion of the sisters' role aligned with the Victorian customs of the era, where women often prepared bodies for burial. What was unusual, according to later historical analysis, was the gradual transfer of this responsibility from family members to the Blackwood sisters exclusively. By November 1878, they had assumed responsibility for preparing every deceased person in Blackwood Hollow, washing, dressing, and arranging the bodies in their coffins before family members were permitted their final viewing. Dr. Hers's medical journal provides one of the few contemporary accounts of the sisters' methods. On October 25, 1878, he wrote, "Having occasion to call at the Matthews home shortly after old Mr. Matthews passed from pneumonia, I encountered the Blackwood sisters in the midst of their preparations. They seemed displeased by my intrusion, but as the deceased's physician, I insisted on confirming the death. The body was laid out on the dining table, covered to the neck with a sheet. When questioned about these items, Miss Margaret merely stated they were necessary for proper preservation. They had already made an incision in the neck, which they claimed was to drain fluids. A practice I am unfamiliar with, but did not challenge at the time. This account, when later examined by medical historians, suggests the sisters were employing techniques similar to those used in early embalming, a practice that was not yet common in rural communities, but was gaining acceptance in urban funeral homes following the Civil War. Various implements were arranged nearby, including several glass jars with rubber stoppers, a set of surgical tools I recognized as being of German manufacturer and quite expensive, and a strange apparatus involving glass tubes and a small hand pump. However, the specific arrangement of tools and the presence of collection jars points to a purpose beyond mere preservation. The sisters also began keeping small mementos from the deceased, a practice not uncommon in Victorian mourning tradition. A lock of hair, a button, sometimes a personal effect the family deemed appropriate to give. These tokens, they explained, would be incorporated into what they called their remembrance tapestry, supposedly a growing textile artwork honoring those who had passed through their care. They asked for a lock of father's hair and his favorite pipe, Franklin Thornfield stated. They said they were creating a memorial artwork that would contain something from every soul they tended to. Mother would have liked the idea of father being remembered in such a way, so I consented. Miss Ruth cut the lock herself, taking rather more than seemed necessary for such a purpose. No such tapestry was ever found. As winter approached, the frequency of deaths in Blackwood Hollow showed no sign of abating, despite the passing of the typhoid threat. November saw 3 more funerals, all catered by the Blackwood sisters, all preceded by their private preparation of the bodies, all followed by whispered concerns about the weight of the caskets. The first of these November deaths involved Elizabeth Kavanagh, an elderly widow who lived alone on the north edge of town. Her body was discovered by a neighbor who brought her daily bread. According to the death certificate signed by Dr. Hers, she died of natural causes consistent with advanced age. Less than a week later, Philip Rogers, a miner in his 30s, was killed when a support beam collapsed. And just before Thanksgiving, young Sarah Mitchell, only 6 years old, succumbed to what Dr. Hers diagnosed as brain fever after a short illness. The Mitchell child's death represents a particularly troubling case in the investigation records. Sarah Mitchell had been in perfect health until November 18th, when she suddenly developed severe headaches and fever. Dr. Hers treated her with standard remedies of the time, but noted that her symptoms progressed unusually rapidly. According to his medical journal, the child's decline follows no typical pattern of brain fever I have encountered. The onset was sudden and violent without the usual prodromal symptoms. More curious still, I learned from Mrs. Mitchell that Ruth Blackwood had visited the day prior to the child's illness, bringing a sweet cake as a gift for the children. When Sarah died on November 22nd, the Blackwood sisters appeared at the Mitchell home within the hour, offering their now customary services. Mrs. Mitchell, overwhelmed with grief, accepted without question. Mr. Mitchell, however, expressed reservations in his later statement to Sheriff Mills. My wife was in no state to make decisions, but something felt wrong about how quickly they took control. Sarah was still warm when they ushered us from the room. They remained with her body for over 4 hours, claiming the preparations were delicate due to her youth. When we were finally permitted to see her, Sarah looked like a porcelain doll, too perfect, too still. They had braided flowers into her hair and painted color on her lips. My wife found it beautiful, but it struck me as theatrical, almost as if they were presenting a creation rather than returning our child to us. Through these accumulated tragedies, The Blackwood sisters moved with increasing authority. "They have become the architects of our grieving," observed Reverend Whittaker in a personal letter to his bishop dated November 29, 1878. "While I cannot fault their efficiency or question the comfort they bring to the bereaved, I find myself sometimes wondering if their influence has not grown excessive. When I suggested to the Mitchell family that their daughter's viewing might be held in the church rather than their home, Margaret Blackwood interceded, insisting the child had expressed a wish to remain in her own bed until burial. How she could know this when the child had been unconscious for days before passing is curious." Reverend Whittaker's growing unease appears in several documents from this period. In addition to his letter to the bishop, his personal journal, discovered among church records during renovations in 1952, contains increasingly troubled reflections. An entry dated December 2nd reads, "I am disturbed by dreams of empty coffins. Twice now I have awakened in the night with the image of those 17 graves opening to reveal nothing but air and wood. I tell myself it is merely the strain of so many funerals in so short a time. Yet I cannot shake the feeling that something unnatural surrounds these sisters. I have taken to marking the registry with crosses, though I could not explain precisely why if asked. Perhaps merely to remind myself to pray especially for these souls." It was mid-December when the first concrete suspicion was raised. Abigail Winters, niece of the recently deceased Milton Winters, arrived from Pittsburgh for her uncle's funeral. Unlike the local residents who had gradually become accustomed to the sisters' prominent role in death rituals, Abigail viewed their involvement with outsiders' eyes. Milton Winters, age 67, had served as Blackwood Hollow's postmaster for over 20 years. He was found dead at his desk on the morning of December 14, 1878, apparently having passed peacefully in his sleep while sorting mail the previous evening. His funeral was scheduled for December 17th, allowing time for relatives to travel to the remote community. Abigail Winters, 29 years old and educated at a women's college in Philadelphia, had trained as a nurse during the latter years of the Civil War. This medical background would prove crucial to subsequent events. She arrived in Blackwood Hollow on December 16th, having traveled by train to Charleston and then by hired wagon to the mining community. According to statements she later provided to authorities, Abigail arrived at her uncle's home to find the sisters already there. Margaret directing the movement of furniture to accommodate mourners, Ruth in the kitchen preparing her signature pastries. They behaved as though they owned not just the home, but the grief itself, Abigail stated in her sworn testimony of January 1879. "When I requested a moment alone with Uncle Milton, before they sealed the casket, Margaret seemed almost alarmed. She said it wasn't seemly for me to disturb their arrangement, that everything had been prepared perfectly for viewing. When I insisted, she reluctantly agreed, but remained in the room, watching me closely." The moment Abigail described next became the turning point in the Blackwood Hollow incident. Upon approaching her uncle's casket, she immediately sensed something was wrong. "I placed my hand on his chest to say goodbye, and the body. It didn't feel right," she reported. "There was something hard beneath the burial clothes, something that shifted when I pressed down. And his face, while peaceful enough, had a hollow quality to the cheeks that seemed unnatural." What happened next was documented in Sheriff Mills's official report dated December 18, 1878. Miss Winters, disturbed by the condition of the deceased's remains, insisted on a closer examination, despite objections from the Blackwood sisters. Upon opening the shirt of the deceased, Miss Winters discovered that the body cavity appeared to have been stuffed with sawdust and rags. Medical examination later confirmed that significant portions of the deceased's internal organs were absent. Abigail's nursing experience proved vital in this moment. In her testimony, she described how she recognized immediately that the body had been altered. The chest collapsed unnaturally under even gentle pressure. Having assisted with post-mortem examinations during my nursing service, I recognized the signs of a body that had been opened and then closed again. When I unbuttoned Uncle Milton's shirt, I found a neat surgical incision running from sternum to navel, carefully stitched with what I recognized as surgical silk, rather than the catgut commonly used for such purposes. The incision had been concealed beneath a layer of white tape and powder. When I pressed along the abdomen, it became clear that the internal cavity was filled with some manner of packing material rather than organs. According to multiple witnesses, Ruth Blackwood fled the room at this point, while Margaret attempted to explain that they had merely prepared the body according to new scientific methods to ensure preservation. When Abigail demanded to know what had happened to her uncle's organs, Margaret allegedly replied, "They were diseased and would have hastened decomposition. We removed them as a kindness to the family." Word of the discovery spread quickly through the small community. Sheriff Mills was summoned, arriving with Dr. Hers to examine the body. Dr. Hers's subsequent examination confirmed Abigail's assessment. Milton Winters's body had been systematically emptied of all major organs, including heart, lungs, liver, kidneys, and intestines. The thoracic and abdominal cavities had been packed with a mixture of sawdust, cotton batting, and dried herbs to maintain the body's shape. The discovery prompted immediate action. Sheriff Mills, accompanied by Dr. Hers and 2 deputies, visited the Blackwood home that evening. The sisters were not present, having left shortly after Abigail Winters's discovery with the explanation that they needed to refresh their supplies. A neighbor reported seeing them depart in their wagon, traveling south on the Charleston Road, Ruth driving while Margaret sat beside her, a large wooden chest secured in the wagon bed. Examination of the sisters' departure revealed concerning details. Sarah Jenkins, whose home stood nearest to the Blackwood property, reported to Sheriff Mills that she had observed the sisters loading their wagon throughout the afternoon of December 17th, hours before Abigail's discovery, suggesting they had anticipated the need for hasty departure. They worked with great efficiency. Jenkins stated, Miss Ruth made 4 trips with a large chest, while Miss Margaret carried smaller parcels wrapped in oilcloth. They had the wagon ready well before sunset, though they didn't depart until after dark. But the authorities found in the cellar of the Blackwood home defied immediate explanation and, according to Sheriff Mills's official report, tested the constitution of even the most hardened among us. According to the official report sealed in county records, until 1965, the cellar contained a makeshift laboratory of considerable sophistication. Glass jars lined roughly constructed shelves, each containing what Dr. Hers identified as human organs preserved in some form of alcohol solution. Labels affixed to the jars corresponded to the names of the deceased from the previous months. A large workable bore evidence of recent use, surgical instruments, several empty preserving jars, and a ledger filled with notations in a precise feminine hand. The collection is extensive and methodical, wrote Sheriff Mills. Hearts, livers, kidneys, and other organs I cannot identify with certainty are preserved in clear fluid. Each jar bears a label with a name and date. The most recent additions appear to be the organs of Milton Winters, not yet fully processed. A partially completed label bears his name and the notation, exceptional quality, minimal degradation. Dr. Hers's separate report provides a more clinical assessment. The laboratory contains approximately 47 preserved organ specimens, representing what appears to be selective harvesting from the 17 deceased individuals. The preservation method employs a solution of alcohol, possibly enhanced with other chemicals I cannot identify. Of particular note is the organization system. Organs are arranged not by individual source, but by type, suggesting a comparative study rather than mere collection. Most disturbing is evidence of experimentation. Several specimens show signs of incision and suturing, while others have been connected to each other with fine glass tubes, the purpose of which I cannot determine. The ledger, partially damaged when finally examined by medical authorities in Baltimore, contained what appeared to be experimental records. Each entry began with a name and date corresponding to a death in Blackwood Hollow, followed by clinical observations about organ condition, preservation methods, and cryptic notations about viability and responsiveness. One of the few fully preserved pages reproduced in the 1965 Medical Examiner's Report contained the following entry: Cooper M. age 9, May 12, 1878. Heart extracted 4.5 hours post-mortem. Excellent condition, minimal tissue degradation. Subject ideal due to youth and sudden death. Preservation in solution A7 appears promising after 24 hours. Tissue maintains color and elasticity. Electrical response test scheduled for May 18th. Noti compare with twin Cooper J to evaluate preservation variables. Another entry partially legible reads, Mitchell S., age 6, November 22, 1878. Subject prepared according to protocol. Administration of compound successful. Transition occurred within projected time frame. Heart harvested 30 minutes post-cessation. Unprecedented preservation of cellular integrity observed. Solution B12 appears optimal for juvenile specimens. Responsiveness to stimulus remains strong after 72 hours. This represents our most promising specimen to date. This latter entry has been the subject of considerable debate among medical historians who have studied the case. The reference to administration of compound and transition occurred within projected time frame has led some researchers to suggest that Sarah Mitchell's illness and death may not have been natural, but rather induced specifically to obtain her organs under optimal conditions. It appears the subjects Margaret and Ruth Blackwood were conducting some manner of medical experimentation. Wrote Dr. Jeremiah Blackwood, no relation of Johns Hopkins University, who was consulted on the case in 1966, when the records were finally made public. The precision of their notation suggests some level of medical training, though no record exists of either woman having attended any recognized medical institution. The nature of their experiments appears focused on tissue preservation and, more disturbingly, some form of responsiveness testing that suggests they were attempting to maintain organ function post-mortem. The sisters themselves were never found. A search of the surrounding forest yielded no immediate results. 3 days after the discovery, their wagon was found abandoned 20 miles south along the Charleston Road, but no further trace of Margaret or Ruth Blackwood was ever confirmed. The wooden chest seen in the wagon was missing, as were their personal belongings. The investigation that followed revealed several disturbing elements. First, the sisters appeared in no official records prior to their arrival in Blackwood Hollow. The Baltimore story was fabricated, as was apparently their claim to widowhood. A telegram inquiry to the Baltimore Police Department, preserved in Sheriff Mills's files, confirmed that no warehouse fire matching their description had occurred within the time frame they had claimed. Further research by county officials revealed that the sisters had presented falsified letters of introduction to Reverend Whittaker upon their arrival. These letters, purportedly from a Reverend James, Stillwell of Baltimore's Third Presbyterian Church, vouched for their character and standing. When contacted, Baltimore church authorities confirmed that no Reverend Stilwell had ever served in that capacity, nor did such a church exist in the city. Second, similar pairs of sisters matching their description and operational pattern had been noted in at least 2 other mining communities in Pennsylvania during the previous 5 years, though under different names. In Colebrook, Pennsylvania from 1873 to 1874, 2 women calling themselves the Sullivan Sisters had established themselves as caregivers to the elderly before departing suddenly after questions arose about missing personal effects from deceased patients. In Miners Rest, Pennsylvania from 1875 to 1876, 2 sisters using the name Blackwood, though with different given names, Helena and Mary, had offered similar catering and body preparation services before leaving abruptly when a local doctor raised concerns about their practices. Records from Colebrook obtained by Sheriff Mills through correspondence with authorities there revealed that during the Sullivan sisters' residence, the community experienced an unusual number of deaths among elderly residents, 11 in 14 months, compared to an average of 3 annually in the years before and after their presence. No formal investigation had been conducted at the time, as each death appeared to have natural causes given the ages and health conditions of the deceased. In each location, they had arrived, integrated themselves into the community through death services, and departed after approximately 1 year. The pattern suggested a calculated approach rather than opportunistic behavior. Most disturbing was the eventual confirmation that every body buried during their time in Blackwood Hollow had been subjected to their harvesting practices. When authorities exhumed several coffins in January 1879, they found each corpse had been hollowed, organs removed, and replaced with various stuffing materials to maintain the appearance of a complete body when clothed. The skill with which this had been done suggested considerable practice extending beyond their time in Blackwood Hollow. The method employed indicates surgical knowledge and precision. Dr. Hers noted in his report to the County Medical Board, incisions were made in locations easily concealed by burial clothing. The cavities were then filled with a mixture of sawdust, cotton batting, and in some cases dried grasses. The face and visible extremities were untouched, presenting a normal appearance to grieving families during viewing. The exhumations, authorized by court order on January 5, 1879, initially focused on the most recent burials: Milton Winters, Sarah Mitchell, Philip Rogers, and Elizabeth Kavanoff. When all 4 bodies showed identical evidence of organ removal, the court expanded the order to include 3 earlier burials: Thomas Parker, Lily Walsh, and James McCreary. These 2 had been subjected to the same treatment. For practical and emotional reasons, authorities opted not to exhume all 17 bodies connected to the Blackwood sisters. The evidence from 7 exhumations was deemed sufficient to establish the pattern, and community leaders expressed concern about further traumatizing families already struggling with their losses and the shocking revelations. The question that consumed investigators then and remains unanswered today was simple: why? What purpose did this macabre collection serve? Several theories emerged during the initial investigation and in subsequent historical analyses. The most mundane suggested the sisters were supplying cadaver parts to medical schools, where demand for anatomical specimens often exceeded legal supply during that era. A letter from Sheriff Mills to medical schools in Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York yielded no confirmation of such arrangements, though one administrator in Philadelphia noted that suppliers of anatomical specimens rarely identify themselves directly to the institutions they serve. Financial records found in the sisters' home offered no evidence of payment from medical institutions. However, their modest bank account at the Blackwood County Savings and Loan showed only regular small deposits consistent with payment for catering services. If they were selling organs, the proceeds were not being processed through normal financial channels. More sinister interpretations proposed they were part of a larger network, conducting unauthorized medical research, possibly connected to several European doctors known to work outside established medical parameters. The precision of their record-keeping and the sophisticated preservation methods they employed suggested scientific purpose rather than mere ghoulish collection. European medical journals of the period contained occasional references to research involving tissue preservation and electrical stimulation of excised organs, work that mainstream medical establishments often criticized for ethical reasons. Several notations in the Blackwood Ledger appear to reference such research, including specific mention of D. Decker, Assay's protocol, and Harvey's galvanic approach, potentially alluding to researchers whose methods the sisters were attempting to replicate or extend. A theological theory emerged briefly in the local press, suggesting the sisters adhered to some obscure religious doctrine, requiring the collection of organs for ritualistic purposes. This was quickly dismissed by religious authorities, consulted by the Blackwood County Register, though it persisted in local folklore for years afterward. The most disturbing theory, based on the sisters' ledger entries and subsequent analysis by medical historians, suggested they believed they were working towards some form of tissue preservation that might eventually allow reanimation, a concept finding purchase in certain scientific circles of that era, though far from mainstream acceptance. Dr. Lillian Harper, medical historian at West Virginia University, wrote in her 1968 analysis, "The Blackwood sisters appear to have been conducting experiments consistent with the most radical scientific theories of their time. Specifically, the idea that life functions might be restored to deceased tissue through proper preservation and electrical stimulation. Their notes indicate methodical experimentation with preservation solutions and regular testing of tissue responsiveness, likely through galvanic stimulation, a technique being explored in European medical circles during this period. Perhaps most disturbing are ledger references to compound administration in several cases, including those of Sarah Mitchell and Philip Rogers. These entries suggest the possibility that some deaths may not have been merely opportunistic harvesting, but deliberately induced to obtain specimens under optimal conditions. While the evidence remains circumstantial, the timing of the sisters' arrival at certain deaths, combined with these cryptic notations, raises troubling questions about their potential role in hastening or even causing some of the 17 deaths that occurred during their residence in Blackwood Hollow. What became of their collection remains unknown. When authorities returned to conduct a more thorough search of the Blackwood home on December 20, 1878, they found evidence of hasty removal, empty shelves, absent equipment, and a still, warm stove containing the ashes of what appeared to be paper records. The remaining ledger pages and several preserved specimens were taken as evidence, but the majority of their collection, particularly the more recent specimens, had vanished, presumably transported in the wooden chest witnesses had observed in their wagon. The case might have faded entirely from public memory had it not been for Professor Harold Jenkins of Appalachian State University. His subsequent investigation led to what county officials in 1879 had termed a potential to cause public black distress and undermine faith in proper burial practices. Initially piqued by a footnote in an 1892 regional history that mentioned the unfortunate events surrounding funeral practices in Blackwood Hollow. Following this thread through Blackwood Hollow, Church records and newspaper morgues across 3 states, he gradually reconstructed the long, forgotten case, bringing it to scholarly attention after nearly a century of obscurity. While researching Appalachian funeral traditions in 1963, Jenkins uncovered references to the hollow grave incident in Blackwood County records. Jenkins's monograph, The Blackwood Sisters, Death Practices and Anatomical Collection in Appalachian Mining Communities, published in the Journal of Appalachian Studies in 1967, brought academic attention to the case, though it gained little public traction. More significant was his discovery, through cross-referencing contemporary accounts and local newspaper archives from multiple states, that the sisters' pattern of operation appeared to continue after Blackwood Hollow. Between 1879 and 1885, Jenkins identified 4 other small communities across West Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee where pairs of women described similarly but using different names established themselves as death workers before departing under various circumstances. In Colton, West Virginia from 1879 to 1880, 2 women calling themselves the Wilson sisters offered funeral services until a fire destroyed their home, reportedly with them inside, though no remains were ever confirmed. In Harlan County, Kentucky from 1881 to 1882, the Apprentice sisters performed similar services until questions about missing jewelry from corpses prompted their abrupt departure. The timing of these appearances, within months of the Blackwood sisters' flight from West Virginia, suggests a continuous operation, moving systematically through remote communities. Local newspaper accounts from these locations describe women matching their general description, one in her 40s, stern and authoritative, the other younger, quieter, with particular skill in cooking and herbal preparations. In each case, they arrived as widows, integrated themselves through service related to death and mourning, and departed when suspicions arose. In at least 2 of these locations, subsequent investigations revealed evidence of similar organ harvesting, though never again on the scale of Blackwood Hollow. According to Jenkins's research, authorities in Clayfield, Tennessee exhumed 3 bodies in 1883 after the hasty departure of 2 sisters who had served as local midwives and death attendants. All 3 corpses showed evidence of organ removal and stuffing, though in a less sophisticated manner than the Blackwood Hollow cases. The trail goes cold after 1885. No further accounts matching their methodology have been verified, leading to speculation about their ultimate fate. Disease, accidental death, or simply a change in approach, all present plausible explanations for their disappearance from historical record. It seems most likely they eventually succumbed to the hazards of their practice, wrote Jenkins. The preservation chemicals they worked with were highly toxic. Consistent exposure over years would almost certainly have affected their health. Alternatively, they may have attracted the attention of more sophisticated medical authorities and either been institutionalized or forced to abandon their work entirely. Perhaps most chilling is the discovery made during renovation of the old Blackwood house in 1969, nearly a century after the original incidents. Workers removing a section of attic floorboards discovered a hidden space containing a single preserved human heart in a sealed glass container. The heart, later estimated to have belonged to a child between 8 and 10 years old, bore a small paper label with a single word: success. The jar and its contents were sent to the state forensic laboratory, but were reportedly lost in transit. No record of its examination exists in state files. The contractor who made the discovery, Martin Reynolds, provided a statement to the Blackwood County Historical Society in 1970. The jar was wedged between 2 floor joists wrapped in oilcloth. It looked like it had been hidden in a hurry. The heart inside was perfectly preserved, like it could have been removed yesterday, not nearly 100 years ago. I have worked construction all my life and seen some strange things, but nothing that made me feel the way that little jar did. Like I was looking at something that shouldn't exist. Given the estimated age of the heart and the known victims in Blackwood Hollow, medical historians have suggested it likely belonged to one of the Cooper twins, whose deaths by drowning would have provided ideal conditions for organ harvesting. Young, healthy tissue with minimal damage. The label, success, implies this specimen represented a breakthrough in the sisters' preservation techniques, though the specific nature of that success remains speculative. Reynolds's account included one additional detail that has fueled ongoing speculation about the case. The heart wasn't just sitting in liquid like you'd expect. There was some kind of apparatus attached to it. Thin glass tubes connected to a small metal device at the bottom of the jar, almost like it was being fed somehow. The whole thing gave me the creeps. I was glad when the sheriff took it away. In the years since Professor Jenkins's investigation, the story of the Blackwood sisters has occasionally resurfaced in academic circles, primarily as a case study in both historical medical ethics violations and the unique vulnerability of isolated communities. The former mining settlement of Blackwood Hollow itself no longer exists, having been abandoned after the McCreary mine closure in 1913. The area was later flooded during the creation of the Blackwater Reservoir in 1954. Occasional visitors to the reservoir's shores report an unusual silence that settles over the water on still days. Local fishermen avoid the eastern cove, where the remains of Blackwood Hollow lie submerged beneath 40 feet of water. They claim that their lines sometimes catch on something below that doesn't feel like the usual submerged trees or structures. Something that shifts when pulled, as if still unsettled after all these years. My grandfather used to fish that reservoir, said Harold Whitman Jeander, descendant of the original coffin maker, in an interview for the Charleston Gazette in 1975. He told me once that he hooked something heavy out there where the old town used to be. When he finally pulled it up, it was a glass jar, all cloudy with age. Inside was something dark that moved in the water. He said he threw it back as far as he could and never fished that spot again. The creation of the reservoir in the 1950s effectively sealed whatever physical evidence might have remained of the Blackwood sisters' activities. The church cemetery, where their 17 hollow victims were buried, now lies beneath the water, as does the site of their home and makeshift laboratory. Whether this submersion represents an appropriate final chapter or merely another layer of concealment in an already obscured history is a matter of perspective. What became of Margaret and Ruth Blackwood, if indeed these were their real names, remains one of the most disturbing, unsolved questions in Appalachian history. Were they isolated practitioners of unauthorized medical experimentation, part of a larger network, or something else entirely? What drove their systematic collection of human organs? And what did they believe they might achieve? The answers may lie somewhere in the scattered records of small town deaths across the Appalachian region, in the spaces between documented history, or perhaps beneath the dark waters that now cover the place where they practiced their macabre craft most extensively. There is a particular horror in the violation of the dead, wrote Dr. Lillian Harper in the conclusion of her analysis. Not because the dead can feel it, but because such violation wounds the living in places beyond physical reach. The people of Blackwood Hollow lost their loved ones, twice, first to death itself, and then to the discovery that what they had mourned and buried was incomplete. Hollowed out by hands they had trusted in their most vulnerable moments. for those 17 families of Blackwood Hollow who unknowingly buried empty shells instead of their loved ones. There would never be answers, only the disturbing knowledge that something precious had been taken, something that could never be reclaimed. Professor Jenkins, in the final paragraph of his monograph, perhaps captured the essence of this case most accurately. The horror of the Blackwood Hollow incident lies not in sensational details of organ collection, but in the profound violation of trust during moments of greatest vulnerability. Death renders us defenseless, not only physically but socially. The Blackwood sisters exploited this ultimate vulnerability, and in doing so, committed a transgression more intimate than mere murder. The last known documentation relating to the case comes from a brief letter found among Jenkins's papers after his death in 1968. Written on faded stationery and postmarked from a small town in eastern Tennessee, it contained only 3 lines. My grandmother spoke of 2 women who helped lay out the dead. She said their hands were always cold, even in summer heat. She said they took more than just memories when they left. The letter was signed simply, "A survivor." Decades after these events, in the quiet corners of Appalachian communities, one can still occasionally hear whispered warnings about strangers who arrive bearing offers of help during times of grief. The story serves as a reminder that the most effective predators are those who approach when defenses are lowest, when sorrow blinds us to questions we might otherwise ask. The final resting place of the Blackwood sisters and the organs they so methodically collected remains unknown. But perhaps the more troubling question is not where they ended up, but what they might have achieved before they disappeared. What experiments were conducted with the specimens they preserved so carefully? What success did that single hidden heart represent? Some questions, it seems, are better left in the silence of history, buried beneath the dark waters that now cover the community they briefly called home.